Hey, happy quarantine. Get into our next PowerPoint here. This is probably going to be a two-part series on Eisenhower because it's going to be that long. Try to keep this to 15 minutes. We'll see if I succeed in that goal. So let's get started with this right away. President before Truman. We're on to Eisenhower now. Eisenhower's presidency is. Let's just get to this. That's better. Eisenhower is going to be president from 53 to 61. He only serves in January 61, but technically 53 to 61. Big deal is he is the World War II general. He's apolitical prior to his presidency. I shouldn't say he's apolitical. He's conservative, but he's not a member of a political party. So both the Democrats and the Republicans wanted him to run in 52. He's relatively politically conservative, so he runs as a Republican and wins in an absolute landslide. I think this is interesting because he campaigns on really a foreign policy that's a liberation ticket. That's going to be the conservative Republicans' response to containment, right? And the Democratic Party is going to be pushing for the idea that we should be containing the Soviet Union. The Republican Party, and specifically the hawks of the Republican Party in the 1950s, are going to be saying we should be invading and taking back things. And so that's really going to be part of his campaign platform that's going to differentiate him from Truman. The reality is, and I read this somewhere a few years ago, the presidency is like a chess game. Like, you look at it and you think you have infinite moves, but the reality is you only have a few opening moves that you can do. Nichols, what do you mean by that? I mean that you're limited in what you can do. And so there's a reason Truman picks containment. It's probably the only real option he has. And the idea that Eisenhower can do anything but containment is probably unrealistic. So he's going to run on this liberation ticket, but the reality is he's gonna practice containment, just to show you the dominating campaign that he runs. And it's really on his war name, right? He's World War II hero, and so he carries just about every state in the United States. If you will notice down here, our friends down south still refuse to vote for Republican. This is 1952, and they are still voting Democrat because the Republicans took their slaves in 1865. There's just your vote count from the 52 election. Kind of a name that you should know, John Foster Dulles. The airport in D.C. is named after him. It's Dulles International. He's going to be the Secretary of State and one of the major designers of Eisenhower foreign policy for the first 4 years of the Eisenhower administration. And this dude is an absolute hawk. You can read the quotes on this page and the next page. But this dude is a true believer that communism is evil, that communism is a scourge that needs to be wiped from the earth. He's going to meet Ho Chi Minh in the mid-1950s, and he'll refuse to shake his hand because he doesn't shake hands with the devil. This dude is a true believer in liberation policy. Just, again, more quotes coming from the main architect of a lot of Eisenhower foreign policy. I think these are the next couple big pages that we want to keep in mind when we start talking about Eisenhower. The first thing is these military ideas. We're going to move to these two things: concept of massive retaliation, and that's going to lead to a new look defense policy. Let's quick talk about what those two are. Massive retaliation is going to be this idea that the next war is going to be a nuclear war, so we need to be nuclearly ready to respond to that. And so what we need is a massive buildup of nuclear weapons. The idea kind of is going to go like this. We're going to have so many weapons that you're not going to want to mess with us. If you make one false move, you're going to be dealing with an American nuclear stockpile and an American nuclear attack that should act as a deterrent to you doing anything dumb. And so that's massive retaliation. It's not the same as MAD, that's mutually assured destruction. That's going to be a little later on into the 60s when the Soviet Union catches up to us with their nuclear arsenal. We're still in the 50s and we still have a relatively large advantage over them. And so massive retaliation is much more of a deterrent, right? You don't want to mess with us because our bombs are bigger than yours. But that's going to result in the creation of, well, we really need to update our army. And the New Look defense policy, so we've got massive retaliation, one big point. New Look defense policy is the next big point that I think comes out of this. And this is going to be a shift to using Air Force power to deliver nuclear weapons. That little plane down on the bottom is the B-57 bomber. That actually cost more to design than the original atomic bomb, because now the strategy has to be you have to deliver your nuclear payload. And we don't have intercontinental ballistic missiles. We don't have the technology to get rockets from the United States to the Soviet Union, so we need planes that can do that. And so that's going to be a massive buildup in the Air Force, and the B-57 being one of the primary things that we're going to spend money on. And so this becomes kind of these two are compatible with each other, right? Massive retaliation is going to lead to a New Look defense policy, which is going to be heavily reliant on an Air Force. But it's also going to reduce the number of traditional troops that we're going to have stationed. More military concepts continued. This concept of brinksmanship, if you read those quotes from Dulles, brinksmanship is we're gonna take it right up to the brink of war. In fact, we're not afraid of talking tough. We're not afraid of talking about deploying nuclear weapons. We're not afraid of talking about getting into the war, and it's totally fine to take things that far. The problem is, if you take things that far, you got to be ready to actually use nuclear weapons. And Eisenhower's actually going to be pretty hesitant to do it. If you actually read the first slide a couple ways back, Eisenhower's no dummy. He was at the Army Academy at West Point, and they read military strategists. And one of the strategists that has always stuck with him is this Clausewitz guy, whose real argument is war is just the last political means, but war can be so strong that it can destroy everything. And so did you really achieve anything if you've destroyed everything? And so that's always going to stay with Eisenhower, is we can't take these things too far, because, well, then what's the point? If you destroy the world, what did you gain? Well, you won the war, but you destroyed everything. So that's gonna stick with him, and that problem is going to get to this next point on this PowerPoint, is these covert operations. And so we're going to push our Army to be an all or nothing response, and we're going to run our mouth and take hard stances and tough stances with brinksmanship. Well, you got to have a way to back out of that, or you have to have a way to ease the tensions without constantly going into massive fights, potentially causing World War III. So you're going to see an explosion in the CIA and an explosion in covert operations, the two major ones under Eisenhower's regime being in Iran and Guatemala. And we'll get into those, one today and one tomorrow. And then finally, I just threw this in here for you super history nerds, the Bricker Amendment. Congress is trying to rein in the power of the presidency to be able to do treaties and really start harnessing almost all the foreign policy under the executive branch. And Eisenhower goes to Lyndon Johnson, who's a Democrat and the leader of the Senate, Eisenhower being a Republican, and sits down and says, hey man, I can't have this and run a Cold War. And LBJ makes sure this Bricker Amendment fails so that foreign policy stays really in the hands of the presidency. I don't know if that fits under military concepts, but I think it does, because it's continuing this tradition of foreign policy and Cold War policy being in the hands of the president. Just to give you an idea of the nuclear stockpile rates going on, this is all Eisenhower, right? Truman's out of office in 1952, so this buildup of nuclear weapons is going to be all Dwight Eisenhower. And so defining foreign policy, yada, 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 liberation, right? But really what you're going to see is containment. You're going to see a lot of tough talk about we're going to free people, but realistically, when we talk about Ike, it's going to be a lot of containment. He'll talk a ton about nuclear reduction and that we should have nuclear peace, but like actions speak louder than words, right? Judge people by what they do and not what they say. And it's so you have talk about liberation, you have talk about nuclear reduction, but realistically, you're going to have a guy following containment policy. And so to sum up these first 10-ish minutes, how's the philosophy of Eisenhower different from the philosophy of Truman? Well, I think containment's the same. I think brinksmanship is new. I think this unilateral action which I didn't really talk about, but this idea that the United States is going to act alone with its air force and its nuclear bombs and not going to go to the UN to ask for multinational intervention is something new, and I think the covert operations are going to be new under Eisenhower. So getting into what does Eisenhower actually do, right? So we've spent the first 10 minutes talking about these philosophical changes. Let's talk about what he does. If you remember back to Truman, the big problem was the Korean War, and it kind of ended as a stalemate. And Eisenhower's first major thing is he's going to need to go and end the Korean War. And so what he actually does before he becomes president in this interim between the election and inauguration day is he travels to Korea to meet with South Korean dignitaries, go see the front lines for himself. And the question he comes back with is, how do you get out of this? You can talk liberation all you want, which is what Truman was talking, or what the Republican Party was talking, but good God, that's going to cause World War III. And what Eisenhower comes back and basically says is he's not afraid to drop nukes on him. That's not a direct quote, but I like it. It sounds nice. And so again, you right away wrote to this brinksmanship of we're not afraid to end the Korean War with nuclear weapons. The Chinese had a great amount of respect for Eisenhower, and so they always are kind of willing to back down from him. But I think the biggest blessing for him in terms of Korea is Stalin dies, and the Soviet Union kind of goes into a funk is the wrong word, but this idea that we should be expanding into Asia maybe is going to subside for a second, and maybe there's a softer Soviet Union that can be worked with. So this is all what's going on for Eisenhower in '53. He's able to get an armistice. Basically, the Korean War doesn't necessarily end with a treaty, but we just agree to all have a ceasefire. And I think the big thing that to take away from this is this quote of, okay, maybe brinksmanship worked. Maybe him talking about nuclear weapons with the North Koreans made them afraid, and maybe that made China afraid. And okay, maybe Stalin was willing to back down, and okay, fine. But I think the biggest thing to take away from this is the only person that can get away with this is Eisenhower, right? War veteran, 5-star general. He's the only person that can pull this off. Had Truman done this, he would have been absolutely impeached for selling out American interests. And so Eisenhower becomes kind of, he's able to get away with things that previous presidents were unable to get away with because he's a 5-star general from World War II, and his ability to talk tough and talk brinksmanship maybe buys him some points with his opponents, and then he can soften up the approach and back out of situations because he can go to the American people and say, I'm Dwight frickin' Eisenhower. So I think that's a good spot for us to end today. We'll talk about Iran tomorrow. We'll talk to you soon. Stay safe.